Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates. The Prince Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, Corporate Partner AU Small Finance Bank, Airline Partner Spicejet.
I'm so happy to welcome you all to this, what promises to be a really rich and deep conversation on Off the Cuff. Our guest today is Professor Francis Fukuyama. Everybody knows him, essentially from his first book, which is a baggage he's carried and he will always carry, and I think quite proudly so. But many others after that. Formally, he's the director of the Center of governance,
democracy, development, and the rule of law.
Development and the rule of law at Stanford University.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Professor Fukuyama. I know that you're very busy and you're much in demand. This is a strange world, but to you, it should look like a familiar world, because we had a conversation on my show Walk the Talk a few years ago in Missouri,
Yes.
India, at the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Administrative Academy. And you had then said something which even I had found surprising and I thought was a bit alarmist. You said that you see not Islamic terrorism as the greatest threat to global stability, but the rise of China.
Yes.
Unfortunately, you were right, and that was very prescient. And who knows that better than us Indians?
Well, I think that the problem is really a generic one in world history, that if you have a very rapid change in the distribution of power, where one country grows very rapidly and gains economic, political, and military power relative to the others, it's going to be very destabilizing. I don't think China is different from other previous great powers in that respect. When China was weak, they had modest goals. They concentrated on their internal development, but now that they're rich and powerful, their ambitions have expanded. And I think that unfortunately, with the rise of Xi Jinping after 2013, the nature of the regime also started to change. I believe that it has made a transition from being an ordinary authoritarian country to something that we political scientists call totalitarian, meaning that the Chinese Communist Party wants to have total control over, the 1.3 billion people that live in that country, and they have the technological means to carry that out. So it's a very unique threat. It's a threat in terms of its power, but also I think in terms of the idea, the China model, a totalitarian country that wants to exert control not just over its own people, but increasingly over its region.
Yeah, because they just arrested, it showed in the way they arrested this professor in Beijing just now. And,
yes.
And also the way they've gone after these two Canadian citizens, because that amounts to hostage taking.
That's right. And I think the security law they passed this past week, extending their rule over Hong Kong, basically undermines the 1997 accord that they had with Britain when Hong Kong was returned to Chinese control. And it's a terrible thing because clearly the people of Hong Kong believe that they're not really Chinese. They have their own identity. They've had their own political system that's one of the freest in the world. And that's all going to end now because the Chinese can't tolerate that kind of open society as part of their system.
So when the change was coming in 1997, I think very wise people and lots of very wise people had said that Hong Kong will change China more than China will change Hong Kong. They must feel quite ridiculous now.
Unfortunately, that's not the way it worked. I think for some time the Chinese held off on trying to incorporate Hong Kong because they wanted to set a precedent for an eventual peaceful incorporation of Taiwan to show that you could have a different political system and still be part of China. I think they've given up on that because clearly the people of Taiwan don't want to be part of China. And so that reduced the incentive that China had to treat Hong Kong as a special case to set that kind of precedent. And so now, unfortunately, the next victim of this kind of expansion may be Taiwan. Last year, at the beginning of 2019, Xi Jinping made a speech in which he said that he expected that Taiwan would come back, into China within the decade, and that this would happen if necessary by force. So I think we've not seen the end of this kind of Chinese assertion of their power over these places that they regard as part of their territory.
What is it that the Chinese are doing, not Xi Jinping is doing with India now?
I think that this is part of a general muscle flexing. I think that he sees the COVID epidemic as an opportunity to push the boundaries on countries surrounding China. So it's not just India. You do have this case of Hong Kong we just spoke about. They've been building up their forces in the South China Sea. They sank a Vietnamese boat recently. So there's a lot of places in the world where they're flexing their muscles and showing their neighbors that they can use force if necessary to expand their interests. And unfortunately, the United States is really not in a position to push back on this strongly, nor is Europe. So it's a good opportunity for them.
So it's one thing to push people around in the seas, but it's quite another to trade fatalities with India. These are the first fatalities. I mean, we know our fatalities, but
yes.
the Chinese at least admit that they have fatalities. These are their first fatalities in 41 years. It's a risk, isn't it? Because they also know that India will not pull back.
No, it's a terrible risk. I think that I've felt for a long time that many people have been complacent about the growth of Chinese military power. They are the one great power that has been increasing their military budget very, very steadily as a proportion of their GDP. They've modernized their forces across the board. The power balance, therefore, has shifted in their favor in all of these areas that are close to them. And I think that this is going to continue. So I think India, has become a frontline state in a sense in resisting this expansion of Chinese power.
And how far will the Chinese push it? Because if India decides to confront it and stand firm, India can
Well, that's something that's hard to know. I think that compared to Russia, the Chinese have been relatively cautious. Putin is a huge risk taker. So he invades Crimea, he seizes, the eastern third of Ukraine, he occupies the territory of Georgia, all these countries on his border. Chinese up till now have been more patient. I think that they felt that they have a winning hand in the long run. They're growing faster than all of their neighbors. And so if they just wait, they're going to be in an even better position. And I think that mentality has not completely disappeared. The other thing is that unlike the former Soviet Union or China under Mao Zedong, the Chinese are still very much interconnected with the global economy. They're completely dependent on export markets in, places all over the world. And so they can't afford to be too openly disruptive by these military adventures. So I think that's something that will continue to temper their actions going into the future.
Because the fact is that while there is asymmetry between China and India militarily, but it's not the same as asymmetry between Russia and Ukraine or Russia and Georgia.
That's right. That's right. I think in confronting India, China is dealing with a much different system that has a lot more potential power. I think that they think at the moment India, again, is weak because of the COVID crisis. They've gotten the epidemic more or less under control in China, whereas it's still a serious problem in India, and so they're taking advantage of that momentary opportunity to, to push what they see as their interests.
So, do you think they are after little slivers of territory, or this is to show India and Narendra Modi down in the neighborhood and to the rest of the world?
Oh, I don't think the territory in that part of the Himalayas is really all that significant. Nobody lives there. It's not like they're big historical claims. I think this is just a demonstration that they can do this, and that, they want to show that India doesn't have any options really in resisting. I think that's really the message that they're trying to send.
Because in India, we believe that China uses Pakistan to triangulate India. So that's an easy, cheap option available to China. They can just choose Pakistan. So why get involved directly?
Well, they're doing a lot of other things besides their support for Pakistan. The Belt and Road Initiative is the single biggest foreign policy that has been put in place by Xi Jinping. And they've developed very close relations, not just with Pakistan, but with Sri Lanka, with, Myanmar, with any number of countries, on India's borders. I don't believe some of the conspiracy theories that say that they've got a very clear strategic plan in doing this, but they clearly are using infrastructure and their ability to help developing countries build infrastructure as part of a campaign to increase their influence. Now, this is an interesting set of dilemmas because Pakistan has actually gotten way overextended. For many years, they were the recipient of, the largest number of big infrastructure projects, but they did too much of it, and they got into a lot of trouble. They're in an unsustainable debt situation. They've had to go to the IMF to get bailed out because they're over indebted to China, and the IMF has not been really happy at the idea of, putting in funds in order to bail out these Chinese development banks. And it's interesting too. I mean, Pakistan was the one country that didn't see a big backlash against Chinese influence, but I do think that that's beginning. So all of that's to say that there are many aspects to this Chinese push. It has many dimensions. So part of it is this direct military confrontation that we saw in the past couple of weeks, but part of it is also a much more long-term series of investments through Belt and Road to build influence and basically, surround India and exert influence throughout the Indian Ocean.
I've read this description here and there, although I've been sort of shy of using it. I'm shy of using any metaphors from Second World War, also given my own inadequate reading of history. But how difficult or how different or how similar is this Xi Jinping's Belt and Road kind of notion to the Japanese, imperial Japanese notion of an Asian co-prosperity sphere?
Well, I think it is different. The Japanese actually sent troops and occupied Manchuria. They occupied Korea. They turned these places into colonial subsidiaries where they forced the local inhabitants to work for Japanese companies, basically enslaving, millions of residents. And so that was a kind of old-fashioned 19th century style imperialism. The Chinese really haven't done that. I mean, the places where they've put military hardware are these man-made islands that they've created in the South China Sea where really nobody lives. And I'm not sure that they would want to occupy a hostile neighbor that has a lot of population that would resist them and that sort of thing, because I just think in the 21st century, there are a lot of reasons why that's not such a winning proposition. Now, Taiwan is a different case because they believe that that's actually their territory, that the Taiwanese are basically their people. I think that what they will find, just as in trying to absorb Hong Kong, is that that's really not true, that these countries really do have separate identities, and their populations are not going to be easily, subdued into thinking of themselves as just, Chinese citizens. But that's so that's really the difference, I think, between what Japan did in the 20th century and what China is doing today.
Yeah, but the Chinese may use the military only for a push here and there. But are there any similarities in the larger vision?
There are, I guess I would say there's the following similarity. The whole purpose of the Belt and Road Initiative is to shift the center of gravity of the global economy. Currently, the global economy is really centered on the United States and Europe, and then the trans-Pacific and transatlantic trade relationships. And the Chinese want to shift that center of gravity to Eurasia and make themselves the center. So the Belt and Road is trying to connect, Southeast Asia and East Asia through China to the Middle East and then to Europe. And that has a certain resemblance to the greater prosperity sphere that the Japanese envisioned. So in that sense, it's similar. It's a kind of state-directed effort to consciously reshape the economic geography of the world. Again, the methods are going to be different because, as I said, the Japanese were using overt imperialism, to do this reshaping, and I suspect the Chinese are not going to do that to nearly the same extent.
How does India deal with this China?
So I think that the main issue for India, has to do with its own governance and preparedness. If you look right now at the Indian military compared to the Chinese military, there hasn't been enough investment. There are a lot of weaknesses in, force modernization, training, a lot of things. And so I think India needs to make further investments along those lines. And, I think India needs to also worry about the values issue. I have certain problems with the direction that Prime Minister Modi has been pushing India in recent years, because I think that it's very hard for a, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, society like India to be governed other than as a fairly liberal order. By liberal, I mean one that, is tolerant of, that kind of ethnic and religious diversity. And that's really been the basis of Indian unity really since independence. And you don't want communal differences, to rise up. That's really what's happening in the United States right now. Since the George Floyd killing, the racial disparities between Black and white Americans has come to the fore. And, that kind of internal division, I think, has made it much more difficult for the United States to face external rivals and challengers. And so I don't think in India you want to allow something like that to happen, because you do need national unity at a time like this.
And you've seen policies from Modi government which are contrary to this need.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think, the changes in the citizenship law that, have disenfranchised a lot of Muslims who thought that they were citizens of India, I think that's really not the direction that a true rule of law country would pursue. And so that troubles me a great deal as I watch, political developments in your country.
How far has India gone in that direction? If you compare India with some of the other countries, say Turkey, you can look at Brazil, because this is a world run by alpha males of the nationalist right.
Well, that's right. I think that India has not gone as far as Turkey. Journalists have come under pressure, but in Turkey, there's thousands of them in jail.
Right.
academics, military officers, basically anybody that's raised any kind of criticism of President Erdogan, end up in prison. And that's not the situation in India. So that's a good thing. And I think that it's
So far, so
important.
good.
Yeah, it's important, I think, for independent media to keep speaking out, keeping the government accountable. I think it's important for civil society groups to maintain their independence, to protest when they think that the government is doing things that, contradict the founding principles of the republic. And that's something that won't happen unless people fight for it. So that's a struggle, that Indian citizens really need to take on as their own.
So you see that military is not strong enough because of lack of investments over time, and socially and politically, India is weakening itself internally.
That's right. That's right. So I think you need to fix both of those things, simultaneously. But in a way, the national unity issue is really the most critical one, because if you don't have that, then it doesn't matter how good your military is.
Right.
It will be misused, or you won't have the kind of social consensus that's necessary to actually have a coherent foreign policy. So these two things are, the foreign policy really is an outcome of the domestic base on which it rests. And if that domestic base isn't strong, the foreign policy isn't going to be strong.
Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping, they've had 18 meetings. And some of these are informal summits. They walk sort of hand in hand, lots of photo ops in exotic locations. Where do you think has this gone wrong?
Well, I think it's just a matter of realpolitik, that you have two very large powers that are neighbors of one another. They don't have consistent interests, and there's only so much that this kind of personal diplomacy can accomplish, because clearly, India sees a lot of Chinese activities in its neighborhood as threatening. And I don't think that you can paper that over just by having a few photo ops. So I would, look to the kind of permanent national interests of both countries, rather than looking to the personalities of the particular leaders that are running those countries at any given moment as a guidepost for where the relationship really needs to go.
So do you think either of the two leaders or either of the two countries made an error in over personalizing this interaction?
To the extent, well, let's talk about the Indian side. To the extent that Prime Minister Modi believed that he could buy Chinese goodwill by this kind of personalization, yes, I think it was a mistake, as opposed to doing the sorts of things that we just talked about in terms of strengthening India domestically and in terms of her military capabilities. It's a common mistake, I think, among populist leaders. I mean, my president, Donald Trump, thinks that he can make friends with, Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and that's going to solve every problem. And that, yeah. And I think that, and with Narendra Modi as well, and I think that's a big delusion. And I think it's a delusion that is, very common among a certain type of populist leader who, sees himself as the savior of his people. He's the one that was chosen to really lead the country. He doesn't need allies or institutions. It's just him and his, brilliance as a representative of the people that are going to fix things. And it never works out that way, unfortunately.
Because one of the pieces in this puzzle that's created a vacuum right now, or a gap, is the absence of America, or is the weakening of America as the global center of gravity. Who does India lean on? If India and America call each other natural strategic allies, who does India call now?
Well, so first of all, I think that America checked out of the international system almost 4 years ago when Trump was elected, but um, right now it does not look like he's going to be reelected. And I think if Joe Biden becomes president next year, you're going to see a very different American foreign policy with a big recommitment to a lot of traditional alliances in Asia and Europe, and I think an effort to, build ties with other democracies. The one thing that I find the most appalling, well, it's hard to say what's the most appalling thing about our current president, but among them is the fact that he seems to like authoritarian leaders like Xi or Kim or Putin much better than other democratic leaders.
Like Merkel, for example.
Yeah, or yeah, Merkel or
Macron.
Justin Trudeau or, and so forth, which is just a absolutely, I think, kind of un-American attitude to not take democracy and democratic values as one of the core principles of American foreign policy. So, if we have a Biden presidency, I think there'll be a return to that kind of leadership role. It's going to be hard. Things will not go back to what they were, 5 years ago, because too much about the world has changed. And now I think there's a kind of distrust of the United States that is different, and it's going to be hard for a new president to shake that off. But I think it'll still be a there'll still be a comeback. The other thing is there's other countries that are in the region that are threatened by by China and by China's rise. Right now, most of the countries in Southeast Asia are extremely worried. Some of them, like Cambodia, have decided to throw their lot in with China, but others, like Singapore, Indonesia, even the Philippines, realize that China threatens a lot of their interests. Japan is certainly another country that has a very difficult relationship with China. Korea thinks that it can balance between all these different countries, but ultimately it also is going to have a lot of problems because North Korea continues to be a big Chinese ally. So, there are a lot of countries.
Australia of all countries.
Oh, of course, Australia, New Zealand, all of these countries are, and Australia's relationship with China has deteriorated very severely since the epidemic started. So I do think that India has a lot of middle powers that it can work with. And I think in the absence of American leadership, it really needs to be active diplomatically to cultivate ties with every other country that's threatened by China.
I have a question from Anand Stanley, who's a smart guy, runs Airbus in India, who says that for India and America, there's a problem because this America is isolationist, this is uncertain, this is aloof, and India still seems to value what it calls as its strategic ambiguity. In that situation, how do these two countries come together? In fact, he says America is unreliable and isolationist, and India seems to love strategic ambiguity.
Well, on the American side, as I said, I don't think the isolationism is an inevitable outcome of American domestic politics. I think there's still a lot of support for an international American role, and hopefully we'll be able to correct that later this year. In India's part, I understand the historical roots of that ambiguity, that really stems from the Cold War and India's unwillingness to align clearly with either the United States or the Soviet Union. But I think that realistically, India has to reevaluate its strategic position in light of China's rise, because I do think that they're just larger forces at work that are going to lead to, a very difficult relationship with China. And in that regard, India needs friends. And one of those friends is the United States that potentially could, be part of a counterbalancing strategy.
So we are not destined to being frogs slowly boiling in a bowl of water.
No. No, I think that, actually, I would say the opposite. In a certain way, the world geopolitical situation is much more fluid than it's been in a long time, because a lot of, you know, relationships that we thought were rock solid are being upended these days. There's more flexibility in who can align with who, and then a lot of underlying changes in the domestic politics of many countries. And so I don't think we should take anything for granted. I think the world could really look quite different in another 5 or 10 years than it did 5 or 10 years earlier. So, and that, you know, in your country, that's, you know, that's one of the countries that may change quite dramatically.
I see your face really lights up when you anticipate what might happen towards the end of this year, which is an unusual event in America, a one-term president, if it happens that way. Now, for a former Republican and a former Reaganite, were you also painted as neocon at some point?
Well, yeah, until the Iraq War.
Yeah. So for someone like that, how does it feel now to really wish that the Republicans lose the presidency?
Well, you know, I never felt any particular loyalty to the Republican Party as such. I mean, there was a certain version of the party that I liked, which was when the elder George Bush was president, and you had people like James Baker and Brent Scowcroft running American foreign policy. That Republican Party was very internationalist, very responsible, very moderate. But you know, in the years following the financial crisis, it got taken over by, well, actually before that, really, with the rise of the younger Bush, and then after the financial crisis, it got taken over by a bunch of ideologues, the Tea Party and, you know, the extreme right, that morphed from a small government right, libertarian small government right, into a nationalist, isolationist, I think basically racist right. And that's what, you know, the current Republican Party represents, and I don't want anything to do with it.
When you said ideological, for a moment my heart stopped. I thought you were going to say idiots.
Yeah, well, that, I mean, at least the earlier generations of right-wing Republicans were competent. I think one of the things that has characterized the Trump administration is sheer incompetence, which you see, you know, manifest in their handling of the COVID crisis. So I don't know whether that's, well, it's bad, obviously, when you're dealing with an epidemic. It's also meant that they can't do some of the things that they want to do because they're too incompetent to figure out how to, you know, bring them about.
Where would you rate Donald Trump on the competency scale in American history?
Well, look, we've had a lot of discussions with that in the US. I think that in a longer historical perspective, I find it hard to see how he couldn't rate close to the bottom of all American presidents since, you know, the founding of the United States. He's, you know, he's somebody that came into office with very little understanding of how the government worked, how the world worked. Most people, when they become president, are intimidated by the office and they learn very quickly. So if they don't know some, you know, like apparently he had a conversation with Prime Minister Modi in which he said, well, it's lucky that you don't have a border with China.
Yes. We just have 3,800 kilometers.
Yeah. And so, you know, usually if you are in that position of being that ignorant, you feel really humble and you try to teach yourself as much as possible so that you overcome this ignorance. And, you know, we have a president that doesn't seem to think it's necessary to do any of this. So I think he's going to, in historical perspective, rate extremely low in the scale of American presidents.
So, and Reagan was quite unlike him because he came in, maybe he didn't know the world so much, but he built a great team around himself.
Yes.
Of people.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing about Trump is that he didn't have a big circle of people that he trusted and could delegate authority to the way Reagan did or George H.W. Bush did. And, you know, it appears that the only people he trusts are his family members. And once you get past that circle, he hires somebody that he doesn't really know. They don't work out. He fires them, replaces them with some other incompetent person. And so there's just been this continual turnover in his own staff. And that's one of the things I think that's actually made him not a dictator, because he can't even organize his own office, much less an entire country of 330 million people.
And yet 45% of Americans will vote for him.
Yes, that's one of the most disappointing things about this country at the moment, that he still, despite all of that, has that level of support.
So I have a fine intellectual mind, Samir Saran, who's president of Observer Research Foundation, and he says in one of your most celebrated works, The End of History and the Last Man, that was written when Pax America was truly dawning on the world, and the ideas of liberalism, democracy, free markets were being seen as omniscient. And then things have sort of gone south or gone wrong since then. And he says your recent work in 2018, that is Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, which is what we are seeing right now in America as well, in its very title captures a new political movement where people are demanding dignity, yet are hateful and resentful. And he says, in fact, what in your assessment allows players from a large section of thinkers and elites in the liberal world to carry propaganda pieces from terrorist organizations and efficient authoritarian regimes like China, but are dismissive of views from divergent players within imperfect democracies?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the reason that we have liberal democracy is it's a matter of values, because, in a liberal democracy, we want to give all citizens dignity by giving them rights. And so there's a normative reason for supporting democracy, but there's also a functional reason. If you base a complex, diverse country on a single religion or on a single ethnic group or on a single racial group and say, that's basically the national identity of our country, you're going to buy yourself a lot of conflict and trouble over time, because that is not the way to rule, a complex, diverse society. And again, this is why, I said earlier, in your country, in India, it's one of the most diverse societies in the world. And it's amazing that, with the number of different languages and ethnic groups and religions, castes that you've managed to hold together as a single society since the birth of the Indian Republic. And I think that the only possible framework for that is as a liberal democracy. I try to imagine what a Chinese-style dictatorship in India would look like, and it's that sort of thing has really never even been attempted, for the whole subcontinent in India's history. So I think, in a way, liberal democracy is a necessary, functional response to diversity. It's the only way that you can govern over diversity peacefully. And that's why I think that it's still the idea, even though it's been challenged by nationalism, or by religious nationalism in recent years. That's why I think it's still an idea that has a lot of power. And I think in the end, people are going to come back to it, because it is the only way that you can govern diverse societies.
Well, if I may translate Samir Saran's question, I think what he wants to ask is that how does the New York Times happily, without any objection, publish an article by the number 2 person in the Taliban, the number 2 leader, but goes into breaks into such a fever that it has to fire its op-ed page editor.
Oh, I see that. Yes.
By a Republican senator.
Yeah. So this is another phenomenon that we've been facing. In a sense, Donald Trump has driven everybody crazy on the left, and so the progressive people have shifted, and there is a very strong current of intolerance and illiberalism on the left as well as on the right. And you see this particularly in university campuses, in the arts, in elite cultural institutions, where there's a very intolerant attitude towards anybody that doesn't signal that they're on board with, a current racial justice agenda. And you can signal this, in all sorts of ways. And I think the New York Times has been guilty of this. And so I think it's up to people that are real liberals to defend attacks against liberalism from people on the right, like Donald Trump, and from people on the left, like these cultural critics that want to shut down, any voice that they don't like.
So you said New York Times has been guilty. If you would elaborate, guilty of what?
Well, the particular issue, that you were referring to was their firing of their op-ed page editor, who allowed this opinion piece by Senator Cotton. And it's just ridiculous, because the op-ed page publishes, as you said, they publish things by the Taliban, by all sorts of very nasty people. That's what an op-ed page is supposed to do. It's supposed to present, other opinions other than the current orthodoxy. And so he did this, and, Senator Cotton is a duly elected U.S. senator. And for this, he lost his job. And there have been other cases of this, of people losing their jobs or being shamed on social media for simply taking, an unpopular position. And I think this is what, we're facing now, at least in many elite circles in the United States.
Have you faced some of this also for some unconventional view or some nonconformist view?
Well, we'll have to see. Harper's Magazine just published a letter that was signed by about 150 leading, intellectuals, academics, journalists, and so forth, defending the idea of free speech, and defending it, from attacks on the left that have appeared since the George Floyd killing. And I'm expecting that there's going to be a lot of fallout. I signed this letter. I was very proud to do it because I think it's an important cause. We'll see how this works out down the road, because already there's been a lot of criticism of the letter, criticism of people, for having signed it, and so forth.
Unusual times. Professor Fukuyama, one of the things you've been talking about lately, and I saw your interview with Fareed Zakaria and other places, and your article also in Foreign Affairs, where you talk about how there is no relationship between the nature of a regime and in its ability or its inability to deal with the pandemic.
Yes.
Because for every case that proves the point that this works, you have a case showing it doesn't work. So if you would elaborate that and tell us, where do you place India in that context?
Well, the argument is basically that if you look across the world, there's no consistent correlation between being a democracy and doing either badly or well in fighting the epidemic. Because among democratic states, some have done extremely well, like South Korea or Taiwan or Germany, and others have done very poorly, like Brazil or the United States. And similarly, among authoritarian regimes, some have done reasonably well, like Vietnam or China did not do well in the beginning, but they've subsequently gotten it under control. And others, Turkmenistan, Russia itself, Belarus have done very poorly. So there's no broad reason to think that a democracy can't deal with a pandemic. I think it depends really on state capacity and on a high degree of social trust between the government and its citizens, and among citizens themselves. Now, India, I think, falls somewhere in the middle. The big issue in India, I think, has always been state capacity. India has not been really good at enforcing rules. It's very difficult given the size of the country and its diversity and so forth. But compared to China, it has a relatively weak state. I think that the early response of, the lockdown was an appropriate one. It delayed the onset of the disease, but, there are a lot of mistakes made in terms of, let's say informal workers and travel bans and this sort of thing. And now I think the kind of longer term weaknesses in the public health system are coming to the fore, where there aren't enough hospital beds, there aren't places, especially where poor people can turn to get treatment as the disease spreads, among them. And so I think that accounts for the the worsening situation in India over time. And again, that's not related to the fact that it's a democracy or not a democracy. It really relates to the capacity of the state to deal with issues like a health emergency.
So trust and the systems you spoke about. So I have a related question from Sunil Munjal, who is a very prominent entrepreneur among the family that owns the Hero Group, former partners with Honda, but now the biggest motorcycle manufacturers. He also runs a think tank called Mind. So he has a question. He says, to overcome an epidemic and its negative impact, fostering trust is critical. What needs to be done so that people can trust scientific experts, citizens can trust public authorities, and countries can trust each other?
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward. I mean, that's where leaders are very important. In South Korea, for example, President Moon Jae-in delegated authority in the handling of the epidemic to a woman that was the head of their Centers for Disease Control, who was a very well-trained public health specialist. And they had a big spike in cases early on. They got that under control. She had, a good system for dealing with it and became one of the most trusted officials in South Korea. On the other hand, in Brazil and in the United States, you had presidents who didn't believe that this was even a problem. They minimized the importance of the epidemic. They actually impeded the ability of their public officials or their public health officials to carry out the policies that they recommended. So it's no surprise that the impact was very bad. To this day, President Trump refuses to wear a mask in public. And, if you have that kind of leadership, of course, it doesn't matter how good your bureaucracy is, it's not going to be effective because people aren't going to trust the words that are coming out of the mouth of people that really know what they're talking about.
Nobody would trust any words coming out of a mouth that doesn't wear the mask.
Yeah, that's right.
So, because one thing that, there's very little that is still known about this virus. In fact, doctors say they know even less about it than they knew a month back, because most of what they knew has turned out to be wrong. But one thing we know about this virus is that it's not a living being, but it has an ego. If you treat it lightly, it comes after you.
Yeah.
Because
that's right.
Anybody who's done that has been hit by this virus, starting with Boris Johnson.
That's right. So I think that populist leaders in particular have done very badly because they want to be popular. They don't want to associate themselves with bad news, and therefore they've, constantly downplayed or not taken seriously the threat that the virus represented.
My colleague, managing editor, YP Rajesh, he wants to know, he says, have the post-World War II institutions such as the UN and then IMF, World Bank, etc. outlived their unity? Do we need to build new institutions or rebuild these, or this world doesn't need them anymore?
Well, so the world obviously needs these institutions. I think that the pandemic shows why that's necessary, because the pandemic doesn't respect borders. You need coordinated efforts to deal with a health crisis like this, but there are many other issues, terrorism, money laundering, climate change, right? These all require international cooperation. And I think it's pretty obvious that the institutions that were created after the Second World War are not sufficient to get you to that level of cooperation that's necessary. I think the problem is that they've proven impossible to reform. So, we've been talking about reforming the Security Council because the current 5 permanent members reflect the balance of power in 1945. They do not reflect the current balance of power, but when you talk about enlarging or changing that membership, there's somebody that's going to veto it, either one of the existing members or, you can't agree on who the new members ought to be and so forth. And I think that's really, so it's a kind of collective action problem. It's not being able to agree on what replaces these outmoded institutions that then, allows them to continue in their zombie-like state.
Which naturally brings us to Trump's idea of a G11, that is a larger group, expand G7 minus China. You think that's a workable idea? And linked to that is a question from Nainima Basu, who covers diplomatic affairs for us. She wants to know, do you think Xi Jinping has overplayed his hand? That is, Chinese dream is turning out to be a failed strategy, wherein China is now uniting the world against it.
Well, look, first of all, this G11 idea of Trump's is ridiculous. I mean, it was dead from the start. There was an attempt to get beyond the G7, which was the G20 after the financial crisis, because there was a recognition that a lot of the world economy was not controlled by the 7 members of the G7. And, you needed a country like China in that group if it were to really have decision-making legitimacy. And so that idea has been out there. Trump, basically was picking a bunch of countries that he had a particular interest in. And the most absurd idea was that he'd bring Putin back into this group. In fact, I think the reason that, Australia and some of these other countries were added to the mix was just to disguise the fact that his real intention was to bring Russia back into the G7. And that is a whole nother question, why he's so indebted to Putin and, is so much a proponent of Russian interests. That's something that nobody has been able to figure out. It's very, very weird. But I think that's really what lay behind that particular suggestion. But it's not going to go anywhere because it's not even clear that the G7 is going to be able to meet anytime soon because they can't even agree on where to meet.
Do you have your own instinctive sense on why he's so soft on Russia and Putin, as you say, Trump?
Well, the suspicion is that the Russians have some hold over him, some leverage. It could be a tape recording of him in Moscow. It could be financial interests, where they bailed him out at a certain point and he doesn't want people to know about that. I think that these conspiracy theories that there's some blackmail that the Russians have that they are threatening to use against him become plausible because it's so hard to explain his behavior otherwise. This consistent support that he's had for Russian interests, because it's really not in his interest. Even in the Republican Party, this is not a popular position overall. So that's why I think, everybody thinks there must be some personal reason. Maybe it's hidden in his tax returns. He's not been willing to publish his tax returns, and it could be that, it's covering up some Russian, deal that he made that he doesn't want people to know about. But we don't know the answer.
Because there has to be a reason why Putin is able to punch way above its weight. Russia is able to punch way above its weight.
Well, so that's, Putin has been an extremely clever leader in that sense in being able to use a relatively weak national starting position and multiply the influence that Russia has had over the world. The best example of that is his use of social media and the internet, because I think the Russians were the first to really figure out that the social media like Twitter and Facebook could be used as weapons to weaken their opponents, and they did that extremely effectively. They can use it to try to sway elections in democratic countries. And it's a tool that really has not been exploited until they figured out how to do it. Now, a lot of other countries are getting into that game, but they pioneered that. They also pioneered this form of hybrid war where, they occupy an important part of Ukraine, but then deny that they're actually doing it. They use mercenaries, they use contractors, so that it doesn't look like they're simply sending their army over an international border, but in fact, that's what they're doing. And I think the final thing to say, which I mentioned before, is that Putin has been willing to take risks that the Soviet leadership was never willing to undertake, putting troops into Syria, putting them into Venezuela. These are things that the former Soviet Union never would have done, but Putin has been willing to take those risks, and so far he's won.
Of global leaders right now, only two have pretty much given themselves the power to remain presidents for life. One is Xi Jinping, one is Putin.
Well, that's right. I think, one of the things that I thought was good about the Chinese system, even though it was authoritarian, was that they had these 10-year term limits on their own leaders. And they went through two complete changes of leadership where basically everybody stepped down and was replaced by a new set of leaders. And that was something that very few authoritarian countries have managed to do. And sure enough, Xi Jinping got rid of that. So he can basically be a leader for life. And Putin, was operating under a similar set of constitutional constraints, and now he's gotten rid of that. So I think they're proving to be more ordinary kinds of dictators of the sort that you see in sub-Saharan Africa, where you're president for 30, 40 years. And again, that's not a good direction for an authoritarian country to take.
Now, Xi Jinping, back to the question, and we are back to China now because we are coming to the conclusion. You think Xi Jinping has overplayed his hand, both externally and internally? Externally, in terms of uniting the world against him by scaring everybody, or internally by creating this completely new power dynamic within the party?
Well, I think both of those things are happening and they're related to one another. If you want total control over your own society, you're also going to want as much control as you can get over the international situation. And furthermore, I think that nationalism is one of the biggest sources of Xi Jinping's domestic legitimacy, the fact that he's made China great again. And so stoking nationalist passion over these border issues, over the South China Sea, over Taiwan, all of these things, I think, contribute to domestic support for Xi within China. And so that's why these issues are related.
And will he respond to this global sort of insecurity about China? Will he reach out to calm these, or will he now become more hostile and build a coalition against it?
I don't think it's fruitful for me to speculate about these kind of short-term tactical issues. I think in general, the pattern has been for China to push hard in some area, and then they meet resistance and they pull back, and then they go at it again another year, 2 years later. Whether they're feeling that this is a unique opportunity for them to push very hard on multiple fronts because of the epidemic is a possibility, but I really don't know. I wouldn't want to hazard a prediction right now.
So, if not a prediction, a prescription for India. So, if I may write a prescription on your behalf, 3 things, and you can change the order if you want to, because I'm not putting them in a particular order. If India has to measure up to China now and the challenge India faces, number 1, India has to get its economy and military in order. Number 2, India has to get its society and unity and cohesion in order. And number 3, India has to shed its strategic ambiguity, fixation with strategic ambiguity and hesitations.
Yes.
Those are your 3 prescriptions?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think I would put them In fact, I would change the order maybe. So I think the domestic unity is number one.
Domestic unity is
uh,
number.
yeah. And then I think building, obviously the economic and military rebuilding is number two. And then the foreign policy, where India builds good relationships with other sympathetic countries, is number three. And I think all of those need to go together as the agenda for any Indian government at this point.
Well, thank you very much. That's a wonderful note to conclude this on, Professor Fukuyama. I'm so grateful you could find this much time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Many, many, many listeners, and they'll be listeners, but I also hope the right people listen.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The Prince off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, airline partner Spicejet.